A lonely rancher inherits an abandoned house in the middle of the desert. When he enters it for the first time, he finds 7 extremely tall women who already live there, as if the place belonged to them. That night, as he pretends to sleep, the women approach him and one of them whispers, "Can you survive all 7 of us?" The man doesn't know if the phrase is a deadly threat, a mysterious tribal ritual, or a proposal of forbidden's desire. The suspense grows. Will he be hunted, tested, or desired? The desert sun beat down mercilessly on John Dusty Miller's weathered face as he guided his horse toward the inheritance that would either save him or finish what grief had started. 3 days of hard riding through unforgiving terrain had brought him to this moment. The ranch house rose from the desert floor like a mirage. Its adobe walls baked the color of old blood by decades of southwestern sun. John had lost everything that mattered. His wife Sarah and their daughter Emma, taken by fever 2 winters past, leaving him with nothing but memories that cut deeper than any. The failing cattle operation back in Colorado had been the final blow, forcing him to abandon the life he'd built and chase rumors of an inheritance from Uncle Jeremiah, a man he'd met exactly twice in his 38 years. The house looked abandoned from a distance, exactly what he'd expected from a hermit uncle who'd lived alone in the desert for 20 years. But as John's horse picked its way through scattered rocks and dying scrub brush, something felt wrong. The place was too clean, too maintained for a property that should have been empty for months. He dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively checking the colt at his hip. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through sage and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Every instinct told him to remount and ride away, but he had nowhere else to go. The front door stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the desert breeze. John pushed it open with the barrel of his rifle, expecting dust and decay. Instead, he found himself staring at 7 women who turned to look at him with the coordinated precision of a wolf pack. They were Apache, that much was immediately clear from their features and bearing, but these weren't ordinary women. Each stood taller than most men John had known, their frames built for warfare and survival in harsh frontier conditions. The shortest among them towered over 6 feet, her powerful shoulders and muscled arms speaking of a life spent in constant physical challenge. But it was the tallest who made John's breath catch in his throat. She stood nearly 7 feet in height, her frame so imposing that she seemed to fill the entire room despite its generous proportions. Her shoulders spanned wider than the doorway he'd just entered, and her dark eyes held an intelligence that was both captivating and dangerous. All 7 wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with practical frontier garments, their long black hair braided with silver and turquoise that caught the light streaming through windows. They moved with the fluid grace of trained warriors, each gesture economical and purposeful. The silence stretched between them like a drawn bowstring. John felt completely exposed, a small man facing forces he couldn't begin to understand. These women could crush him without effort, yet something in their collective gaze suggested they were evaluating rather than threatening. The tallest woman stepped forward, her movement causing the floorboards to creak under her substantial weight. When she spoke, her voice was deep and melodious, carrying an accent that made English sound like music. "You are John Miller, Jeremiah's nephew." It wasn't a question. Somehow they knew exactly who he was and why he'd come. John managed to nod, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "I am Ayana," she continued, gesturing to herself before indicating the others. "These are my sisters, Itzel, Kashina, Nayeli, Sitlalij, Xochitl, and Ixkel." Each name rolled off her tongue like poetry, and each woman acknowledged her introduction with a slight nod. John found himself memorizing their faces, trying to match names to the imposing figures before him. "Your uncle spoke of you often," Ayana said, moving closer until John had to crane his neck to meet her eyes. "He said you would come when the time was right. He's been dead for 3 months, John managed to say. "Yes," Ayana replied simply. "We buried him ourselves." Apache tradition, as he requested. The implications hit John like a physical blow. These women had been living here, caring for his uncle, treating this place as their home. And now he'd arrived to claim an inheritance that was already occupied by 7 Apache warriors who could snap his neck without breaking stride. "This is my property now," John said, trying to inject authority into his voice. "I have the legal papers." Ayana smiled, an expression that was both beautiful and terrifying. "Legal papers mean little in the desert, John Miller, but we are not here to fight you for ownership." She gestured around the room. which John now noticed was immaculately maintained, furnished with a mixture of frontier practicality and Apache craftsmanship. "We are here because this place chose us, just as it chose your uncle, just as it has now chosen you." "I don't understand." "You will," said another voice. Itzel, the second tallest, stepped forward. She stood perhaps 6.5 feet, her frame slightly more slender than Ayanna's, but no less imposing. "Understanding comes with time and trust." The afternoon passed in a strange dance of coexistence. The women went about their routines as if John weren't there, tending a garden behind the house, preparing food, maintaining equipment with practiced efficiency. John found himself watching their movements, fascinated despite his confusion. They worked together with an almost supernatural coordination, anticipating each other's needs without words. When Kashina needed help moving a heavy water barrel, Nayeli was already there to assist. When Sitlali began preparing the evening meal, Xochitl appeared with fresh herbs from the garden. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the women gathered around a fire pit in the main room. John sat awkwardly on the periphery, uncertain of his place in this strange household. "Your uncle told us about your losses," Ayanna said quietly, her voice carrying easily across the space between them. "The fever that took your family, the ranch that failed, the loneliness that follows you like a shadow." John's throat tightened. He hadn't spoken of Sarah and Emma to anyone in months, couldn't bear the sympathy in people's eyes or the empty platitudes about God's plan. "He said you were a good man broken by circumstances beyond your control," Itzel added. "A man who needed healing but didn't know how to ask for it." "What does any of that matter to you?" John asked, his voice rougher than he intended. The 7 women exchanged glances, some form of silent communication passing between them. Finally, Ayanna spoke. "Because healing is what we do, John Miller. It's why we're here, why your uncle brought us to this place, why you've arrived now when you need us most." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the adobe walls. John felt something shifting inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and anger he'd carried for so long. "I don't understand any of this," he admitted. "Sleep," Ayanna said, rising to her full imposing height. "Tomorrow, we begin your education." John retreated to the small bedroom that had apparently been prepared for him, his mind reeling with questions and possibilities. The bed was comfortable, the room clean and welcoming, but sleep eluded. Through the thin walls he could hear the women moving about the house, their voices low and musical as they spoke in Apache. He must have dozed eventually because he woke to the sensation of someone standing beside his bed. In the darkness he could make out a tall figure leaning over him, close enough that he could feel warm breath against his ear. "Can you survive all 7 of us?" The whisper was so soft he might have imagined it, but the words sent electricity through his entire body. John's eyes snapped fully open, but the figure was gone. Only the lingering scent of sage and something indefinably feminine remained. His heart pounded as he stared at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. Was it a threat? A challenge? Or something else entirely, something that made his blood run hot despite the cool desert night? The question echoed in his mind until dawn finally broke over the eastern mountains, bringing with it the promise of answers he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. Morning came with a sound of activity throughout the house. John emerged from his room to find the women already engaged in their daily routines, moving with the same coordinated efficiency he'd observed the day before. The scent of coffee and cooking food filled the air, making his stomach growl with sudden hunger. Ayanna looked up from where she was tending the fire, her dark eyes meeting his, with an intensity that made him remember the whispered question from the night before. "You slept poorly," she observed, not making it a question. "Strange dreams," John replied carefully. "Dreams are messages," said Extel, the youngest of the 7, though still tall enough to look down at John from her height of over 6 feet. "The desert speaks to those who listen." John accepted a cup of coffee from Nayeli, noting how her massive hands made the ceramic mug look like a child's toy. Everything about these women was larger than life, from their physical presence to the way they seemed to command the very air around them. "What did my uncle tell you about me?" John asked, settling onto a wooden bench that creaked under even his modest weight. "That you were a man who had forgotten how to live," Sitlali answered, her voice carrying a musical quality that made even simple words sound like poetry. "That you needed to remember what it meant to feel alive." "And you think you can teach me that?" The 7 women exchanged those silent glances again, and John got the distinct impression they were having an entire conversation he couldn't hear. "We can try," Ayanna said finally, "but only if you're willing to let us." "What would that involve?" "Trust," Itzel said simply. "Complete trust." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. John had trusted before, trusted in love and family and the future, only to have it all torn away. The idea of opening himself to that kind of vulnerability again terrified him more than facing down armed men. "I don't know if I can," he admitted. "Fear is natural," Cassina said, speaking for the first time since his arrival. Her voice was deeper than the others, carrying an authority that suggested she might be older, despite her youthful appearance. "But fear that controls you becomes a prison. Your uncle was afraid too, when he first came here," Xochitl added. "Afraid of his past, afraid of his future, afraid of being alone. We helped him find peace." "How?" "By showing him that he wasn't alone," Ayana said, rising to her full, imposing height. "By teaching him that strength comes not from standing apart, but from standing together." She extended her hand toward him, palm up. Her fingers were long and elegant despite their obvious strength, her skin warm and calloused from years of hard work. "Come with us today. Let us show you what your uncle discovered." John stared at her outstretched hand, knowing that taking it would change everything. There would be no going back to his old life of isolation and grief. Whatever these women offered, it would demand everything he had to give. But as he looked into Ayana's dark eyes, he saw something that made his decision for him. Not pity or manipulation, but genuine care. These women wanted to help him, not because they had to, but because they chose to. He reached out and took her hand. Her grip was firm and warm, her skin soft despite its obvious strength. As she pulled him to his feet, John felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. The day that followed was unlike anything John had ever experienced. The women led him through the desert surrounding the ranch, showing him hidden springs and ancient paths that his uncle had learned to navigate. They moved through the harsh landscape with an ease that spoke of deep familiarity, their tall frames perfectly adapted to the demanding terrain. John found himself struggling to keep up, his body soft from months of grief and inactivity. But whenever he faltered, one of the women was there to offer support, Nayeli's strong hand steadying him over rough ground, Citlali pointing out safe footing on treacherous slopes, Ixchel sharing water from her canteen when the sun grew too intense. They spoke little during the trek, but John began to understand that communication between these women went far beyond words. A glance from Yana would send Itzel ranging ahead to scout the path. A subtle gesture from Cassina would have Xochitl adjusting their direction to avoid difficult terrain. It was like watching a single organism with 7 bodies, each part perfectly attuned to the others. John felt clumsy and disconnected by comparison, an outsider trying to understand a language he'd never learned. But gradually, as the day wore on, he began to pick up subtle cues. The way Ayana's shoulders tensed when she sensed danger ahead, the soft whistle Itzel used to signal all clear, the particular way Nayeli moved when she'd spotted something interesting. By the time they returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, John felt as though he'd been given a glimpse into an entirely different way of existing. These women didn't just live in the desert. They were part of it, connected to its rhythms and secrets in ways that went beyond mere survival. "You did well today," Ayana said as they gathered around the evening fire. "Better than your uncle did on his first journey with us." "I felt like I was stumbling around blind," John replied. "Blindness is temporary," Itzel said. "Learning to see takes time." "What exactly am I supposed to be learning to see?" The women exchanged those meaningful glances again, and John sensed he was approaching something important, some revelation that would explain their presence and their interest in him. "Yourself," Ayana said finally. "The man you could become, if you let go of the man you think you have to be." That night, John lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, his body aching from the day's exertions, but his mind more alert than it had been in months. The women's words echoed in his thoughts, mixing with memories of Sarah and Emma, with regrets about the life he'd lost and fears about the future he couldn't see. He must have dozed, because once again he woke to the sensation of a presence beside his bed. This time, he could make out more details in the darkness. The figure was tall and graceful, moving with the silent precision he'd come to associate with all 7 women. "Can you survive all 7 of us?" The whisper came again, but this time John was ready for it. "What does that mean?" he whispered back. But the figure was already gone, leaving only questions and the lingering scent of sage and desert flowers. The pattern continued for days. Each morning brought new lessons, new journeys into the desert, new insights into the way these remarkable women lived and thought. John found his body growing stronger, his senses sharper, his understanding deeper. He learned that Ayana was indeed the leader, but that her authority came from wisdom and consensus rather than dominance. Itzel was the strategist, always thinking several steps ahead. Kashina was the keeper of traditions, the one who remembered the old ways. Nayeli was the nurturer, the one who ensured everyone's needs were met. Citlali was the artist, seeing beauty where others saw only harsh reality. Xochitl was the healer, understanding the medicinal properties of every plant in the desert. And Ixchel was the dreamer, the one who looked toward the future with hope and vision. Each night brought the same whispered question, sometimes from one voice, sometimes from another. John began to understand that it wasn't a threat or even a challenge in the traditional sense. It was an invitation, a question about his willingness to open himself completely to whatever they offered. But what exactly were they offering? The question haunted him as he grew stronger and more confident in their presence. These women could have any man they wanted. Their beauty was matched only by their strength and intelligence. Why were they interested in a broken-down rancher with nothing to offer but grief and failure? The answer came on the seventh night, when John woke not to a whispered question, but to find all 7 women standing around his bed, their tall forms creating a circle of imposing presence in the darkness. "It's time," Ayana said softly. "Time for you to choose." John sat up slowly, his heart pounding. "Choose what?" "Whether you want to remain a visitor in our world, or become part of it," Itzel replied. "What would becoming part of it mean?" "Everything," Kashina said simply. "Complete surrender to what we offer. Complete trust in who we are. And what do you offer?" Ayana stepped closer, her massive frame somehow managing to be both intimidating and comforting. "Love, John Miller. Not the gentle, safe love you knew before, but something wilder and more demanding. Love that will challenge every assumption you have about yourself and what you're capable of. All 7 of you?" John's voice came out as barely a whisper. "We are not separate beings seeking individual connections," Nayeli explained. "We are a family, a unit, a force that exists as one. To love one of us is to love all of us. To be loved by one is to be loved by all." The concept was overwhelming, beyond anything John had ever imagined. But as he looked at their faces in the dim light, he saw not predators or manipulators, but women offering him something precious and rare, a chance to belong completely, to be part of something larger than himself. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you understand loss," Citlali said. "Because you know what it means to have everything stripped away and still keep breathing. Because you have the capacity for the kind of love we need," Xochitl added, "deep and loyal and willing to sacrifice." "Because your uncle saw something in you that you haven't seen in yourself yet," Ixchel finished. John felt tears threatening, emotions he'd kept locked away for months, threatening to overwhelm him. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." "Strength isn't about what you can endure alone," Ayana said, reaching out to cup his face in her large, warm hands. "It's about what you can become when you're not alone anymore." The ritual that followed was unlike anything John could have imagined. It wasn't violent or overwhelming, but rather a gradual awakening of senses and emotions he'd thought were dead forever. Each woman brought something different to the experience. Ayana's commanding presence that made him feel protected and cherished. Itzel's strategic mind that anticipated his every need. Kashina's deep wisdom that connected him to something ancient and powerful. Nayeli's nurturing touch healed wounds he didn't know he carried, while Citlali's artistic soul showed him beauty in places he'd never thought to look. Xochitl's healing knowledge soothed not just his body, but his spirit, and Ixchel's dreams gave him hope for a future he'd never dared imagine. It was a night of surrender and discovery, of giving up control and finding strength he never knew he possessed. By dawn, John understood that he had indeed survived all 7 of them, but more than that, he had been transformed by them. When the sun rose over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, John found himself surrounded by 7 women who had become his family, his purpose, his reason for living. The broken man who had arrived seeking only shelter had been reborn as someone capable of love beyond anything he'd previously imagined. "So," Ayana said, her voice warm with satisfaction as she traced patterns on his chest with her fingertips, "did you survive us?" John laughed, the sound surprising him with its genuine joy. "I think I did more than survive. I think I finally learned how to live." The months that followed brought changes John could never have anticipated. The ranch, which had seemed like a refuge from the world, became a thriving center of activity. The 7 women possessed skills and knowledge that transformed the failing property into something remarkable. Ayana's leadership abilities attracted other Apache families seeking a place where they could live in peace with white settlers. Itzel's strategic mind developed trade relationships that brought prosperity to the entire region. Kashina's knowledge of traditional ways provided stability and wisdom to guide their growing community. Nayeli's nurturing nature created a sense of family that extended far beyond their immediate household. Sitalali's artistic talents produced crafts and artwork that were sought after throughout the territory. Xochitl's healing abilities made their ranch a destination for those seeking medical care unavailable elsewhere. And Ixchel's vision for the future helped them plan for growth and expansion that would benefit everyone. John found himself not just accepted, but essential to their success. His knowledge of white customs and law helped navigate the complex political landscape of the frontier, while his growing understanding of Apache traditions allowed him to serve as a bridge between two worlds that had too often been at war. But more than his practical contributions, John discovered that he brought something these remarkable women had been missing: a different perspective, a gentle strength that complemented their own fierce power, and a love that was both humble and absolute. The whispered question that had once filled him with uncertainty became a source of joy and pride. Yes, he had survived all 7 of them. More than that, he had learned to thrive in their presence, to contribute to their strength rather than simply benefit from it. The ranch became known throughout the territory as a place where impossible things happened, where Apache and white settlers worked together in harmony, where 7 giant women and 1 ordinary man had created something extraordinary out of love and trust and mutual respect. Federal authorities, initially suspicious of the unusual arrangement, eventually recognized the political and economic benefits of the peaceful community that had developed. Territorial officials pointed to the ranch as an example of what could be achieved when different cultures worked together rather than against each other. But for John, the true measure of success wasn't political or economic. It was the moment each evening when he found himself surrounded by 7 women who had chosen to share their lives with him, who had taken a broken man and helped him become whole again. As he sat by the fire on the anniversary of his arrival, watching Ayana direct some new construction project with her characteristic blend of authority and grace, John reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The grief and loss that had driven him into the desert seemed like experiences from another lifetime, important for the lessons they'd taught, but no longer defining who he was. Regrets? Itzel asked, settling beside him with the fluid grace that still took his breath away even after all these months. Only that it took me so long to find you, John replied honestly. You found us exactly when you were supposed to, Kashina said, joining them with the others following close behind. The desert has its own timing. As the 7 women arranged themselves around him in the familiar circle that had become their evening tradition, John felt the same sense of wonder that had filled him on that first night when they'd asked if he could survive them all. He had done more than survive. He had learned to love beyond anything he'd thought possible, to be part of something larger and more beautiful than he'd ever imagined. The question that had once terrified him now filled him with pride and gratitude. Yes, he had survived all 7 of them, and in doing so, he had finally learned how to truly live. The desert wind whispered through the sage outside their home, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. John closed his eyes and listened to the voices of his 7 wives as they planned and dreamed and built their future together, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they faced everything else, together, united, and stronger than any force that might try to tear them apart. In the end, survival had turned out to be just the beginning. What came after was something far more precious, a love that defied convention, a family that transcended boundaries, and a life that proved that sometimes the most impossible dreams were the ones most worth pursuing.